So let's take a look with that background in mind, Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, and notice what it says. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor pain to give birth. And another sign was seen in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his head 7 diadems, and his tail swept a third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman that was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule all of the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. What in the world is going on here? What this is a history lesson. It's a revelation of strategy number 1 that Satan tried and it didn't work, trying to stop the birth of Jesus Christ. But this is no ordinary history lesson. This is a history lesson narrated from the perspective of the angels. This is describing what was happening in the invisible realm, the invisible world, the invisible war, as biblical events were happening in the physical world, because what's happening in the invisible world dictates largely what's happening in the physical world. It's just we as humans can't see it. And so we're dependent on certain parts of the Bible to pull back the veil for us, to pull back the curtain for us, to give us understanding into this invisible conflict, to give us understanding in the long invisible war against Christ. Apparently, Satan has declared war on Christ for a long time, exercising strategy number 1, yet to no avail. Now, this is a little bit tricky to understand because obviously, when you study Revelation 12, verses 1 through 5, it sure doesn't read like the Gospel of John. It sure doesn't read like the book of Romans. You're dealing here with heavily symbolic material. In fact, you'll notice the word sign appears in verse 1 and verse 3. That shows us we're dealing with symbols here. And you'll notice the Greek word Simeon, translated sign. What we have just fallen into here in Revelation chapter 12 is the most symbolic chapter of the most symbolic book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. It doesn't get more symbolic than what we're reading here. And yet, there's a very easy way to ascertain what every symbol here means. And if you follow the rules I'll give, you can figure out virtually any symbol anywhere in the Bible, anywhere in the book of Revelation. Well, there's obviously 3 symbols here. The word sign alerts us to that fact. You have the sun, S-O-N, not to be confused with the sun, S-U-N, in verse 1. Sun, S-O-N, verse 5. Then you have a dragon, verse 3. Then you have a woman clothed with the sun, S-U-N, the sun, moon, and the stars, verse 1. So this is obviously 3 symbols, and you need these 3 symbols to understand what Satan is doing related to strategy number 1. So how would we figure out what these 3 symbols are? Well, there's basically 2 rules. You follow these 2 rules, you'll understand every symbol in the whole Bible. You'll understand every symbol in the book of Revelation. The first rule is you search the immediate context. Because many times in the same context, usually in the same paragraph, usually in the same chapter, the symbol will be interpreted. Why does God do that? Because He doesn't want us to rely upon our sanctified imaginations to interpret His Word. If you get on YouTube, I've seen some of the craziest interpretations ever on Bible prophecy. Because people just come to a symbol and they just dump into it any meaning they want, and they don't pay attention to the rules or the context which will usually interpret the symbol for you. Now, John Walvoord in his commentary on Revelation says this happens 26 times in the book of Revelation. Well, what if the immediate context doesn't help you? Then you've got to go to other places of the Bible. With the book of Revelation, you've got to go to the Old Testament. It is very interesting. The book of Revelation has 404 verses in it. 278 of the 404 verses are references or allusions to the Old Testament. Robert Thomas, in his commentary on the book of Revelation, gives us that number. And the reason that the book of Revelation is so mystical to us and it's so foreign to us is we really haven't studied the Old Testament. If you know a little something about the Old Testament, suddenly the things in the book of Revelation start to make sense. So, with those two rules in mind, let's apply them to our three symbolic characters so we can understand this angelic history lesson, so that we can understand Satan's past strategy that failed. The first symbol here is the sun, S-O-N, verse 5. Now, any guesses as to who that would be? Look at Psalm 2, verse 9. It says, "You," a messianic psalm, "shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware." This one coming who will rule all of the nations with a rod of iron, if you know Psalm chapter 2, is a very clear reference to the Messiah or Yeshua or Jesus Christ himself. And it's sort of a giveaway when you go back to Revelation 12, verse 5, where it says the Son, S-O-N, was caught up to God and his throne. Any guesses as to when that happened in biblical history? Well, that's Acts 1, verse 9, the ascension. It says, and they said these things as he was lifted up while they were looking on, and a cloud received him out of their sight. If you know Acts 1, verse 9, and you know Psalm 2, verse 9, you know that the Son, S-O-N, verse 5, is none other than Jesus Christ. All right, well, what about this second symbol here? There's a dragon. Well, that's not hard to decipher either, because if you go down to verse 9, look at what it says. Same chapter. "The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world." Notice the very end of the book of Revelation, chapter 20. And notice, if you will, verse 2. Notice what it says. "And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who was the devil, and bound him for 1,000 years. There the serpent is called none other than Satan himself. So, using the simple rule, search the immediate context, you know exactly who the dragon is. You don't have to use your sanctified imagination, because the Bible is its own interpreter. The tricky one is this woman, verse 1, clothed with the sun, S-U-N, the moon, and the 12 stars. There are a lot of people out there that will tell you that this woman is the church. Houston, we have a problem with that. Why is that? Because this woman is giving birth to Jesus. The church never gave birth to Jesus. In fact, Jesus gave birth to the what? To the church. Jesus said in Matthew 16, verse 18, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." This is talking about an entity, whoever this woman is, giving birth to Jesus. And by the way, if this is the church, I thought the church was supposed to be a virgin bride betrothed to Christ. This lady's pregnant, and I think the groom might be a little upset about that. Amen? So this can't be the church. In fact, the word church isn't even used here. Other people say, well, this must be the Virgin Mary. That's probably closer to the truth, but you'll notice the word sign there. The Virgin Mary was a literal person. What we're studying here is a sign or a symbol for something else. And the problem is, you can go through Revelation 12, you can go through the whole book of Revelation, and this woman, verse 1, clothed with the sun and the moon and the stars, will never be identified anywhere in the book of Revelation. So if that happens, where do we go? The Old Testament. And if you know the Joseph story, you start to see an immediate parallel. Now he, that's Joseph, still had another dream and related it to his brothers and said, Lo, I still had another dream, and behold, the sun, S-U-N, the moon, and the 11 stars, Joseph being the 12th star, were bowing down to me. Does that start to sound familiar? He related it to his father, that would be Jacob, and to his brothers, and they said, this is great. Praise the Lord that God has given you this vision. No, they were jealous of him. They rebuked him. And in the process of the rebuke, the symbols in the dream start to get deciphered. Rebuked him and said to them, what is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come down to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? And this is what got Joseph betrayed by his brothers, thrown into the pit, sold as a slave into Egypt. It was just pure jealousy. Because this vision was given to Joseph when he was 17 years old. By the time he hits age 30, the dream is fulfilled, where he's elevated to second in command over all of Egypt, and his family comes to him to find grain in the midst of famine. But you'll notice that as this is interpreted, the son, S-U-N, who would that be? That would be Jacob, his father. The moon would be who? Leah, Jacob's wife. You say, what about Rachel? Rachel already died. Rachel died in Genesis 35. Jacob had 2 wives, right? As you know the biblical story. This is Leah. The 11 stars would be Joseph's who? Brothers bowing down to Joseph, the 12th star. The 12 stars taken as in whole represent the 12 tribes of Israel, Jacob's dozen, Jacob's sons, who became the 12 what? The 12 tribes. So Genesis 37 tells us that the sun and the moon and the 12 stars taken together is none other than the nation of Israel. Why is this important? This is important because many people are telling you that the book of Revelation, many people are telling you today that the book of Revelation can't be understood. This is a view called postmodernism. The view of postmodernism is all truth is uncertain. And I usually say, are you certain about that? Because you can be uncertain about anything except your own uncertainty. That becomes a certainty. You can be agnostic about anything except the reality of your own agnosticism. And it's a view that says you can't get to the truth, and the postmodernists have a field day with the book of Revelation. They say it can't be understood. In fact, did you know that some of the greats in church history wouldn't touch the book of Revelation? John Calvin, one of the most voluminous writers in church history, comments through commentaries on every single book of the Bible, except the 2 little John letters, 2 John, 3 John, and Revelation, on the grounds that the book of Revelation can't be understood. Martin Luther, who we respect as a church reformer, didn't even think the book of Revelation should be included in the biblical canon. And so all through the centuries, people have told you the book of Revelation can't be understood. And yet, isn't it interesting that little old me and little old you, by just applying a few simple rules, can understand the whole thing? I like what Henry Morris says in his commentary. It must be stressed that revelation means unveiling, not veiling. In fact, Revelation 1 and verse 1 gives us the title of the book of Revelation. It's a translation of the Greek noun apokalypsis, which means to disclose. Why would a book be called the disclosure if God didn't want us to understand what it means? And so what is happening here is a history lesson rightly understood from the angelic perspective. Now look at verse 4, right in the middle of the verse. And the dragon, who's the dragon? Satan. And the dragon stood before the woman. Who's the woman? Israel. The dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. Who's the child? Jesus Christ. What is being described here is what was happening in the spiritual world when Jesus himself was born into our physical world. You see, if you were simply to study Matthew's gospel and Matthew's recounting of this, the only thing it tells you is there was a man named Herod who was insecure over his own throne. He found out where the Christ child was going to be born, and he began to kill all of the male infant Bethlehem innocent children. And that's all Matthew 2 tells you. The book of Revelation comes along and says, let me give you that same story. But let me tell you what was happening in the invisible world, in the spiritual world, as that story was unfolding in the physical world. It was actually the devil himself who was using Herod as his instrument to prevent Jesus from coming into our world. Now, when I talk to preachers or would-be preachers, I say, look, when it comes to Christmas time, don't give them Matthew 2 again. They've heard that 10,000 times. They already know the Matthew 2 story. Give them Revelation 12. That'll be a Christmas message they'll never forget. And essentially what this is it's a divine commentary on the strategy of Satan to stop the fulfillment of the first messianic prophecy ever been given in Scripture in Genesis 3 verse 15. Genesis 3 verse 15, I think, is perhaps the most important verse in the Bible, because if you can understand Genesis 3 verse 15, you can understand the whole Bible. The whole Bible is an unpacking of Genesis 3 verse 15. Remember when our forebears fell in Eden? Remember what God said? I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Now, there's coming one from the seed of the woman. Who's the woman here? Eve. Who's going to take your head, Satan, and crush it. That's a reference to the coming Messiah. Now, along the way, you're going to be able to exercise some damage of a temporary nature. You're going to be able to bruise his heel, but he's going to crush your head. If you had your choice, would you rather have your heel bruised or your head crushed? I'll take the heel, because once your head is crushed, it's over. So Satan, who was in Eden as a serpent to hear this prophecy, is put on notice. His intellect does not work correctly. His splendor has been corrupted. His splendor has corrupted his wisdom. And he is working in history to stop that prophecy from being fulfilled. And that's why he moves into strategy number 1, to stop the lineage leading to Christ. That's what the whole Old Testament is about. If you understand that, then all the details of the Old Testament start to fit into place. That's kind of weird. Why does Genesis 4 record Cain killing Abel? 1 John 3 verse 12 tells us that the evil one, Satan, was in the thoughts of Cain. Satan reasoned that the Messiah is going to come through Abel's lineage. And so because Abel's sacrifice was accepted, right? Cain's was rejected. He thought the Messiah is going to come through Abel. I'll fix this problem right now. I'll have Cain murder Abel. If you don't understand Genesis 3 verse 15, you don't understand why that murder happens in Genesis chapter 4. You see that? And God always gets around it supernaturally, in this case, through the birth of who? Seth. Or what about that weird story in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4? Sons of God, who I understand as angels, cohabitating with human women. Why would that happen? Well, there again, Satan is at work trying to mix or damage the genetics of the human race so that a Messiah can't be born that's fully man. You say, I need some more explanation on that. Well, when I get into the subject of angelology in Sunday school, I'll give you the reasons why I think that's true. But it fits this pattern. How about Exodus chapter 1, where Pharaoh arises and he begins to enslave the Egyptians, and he begins to take the infants and have them drowned in the Nile. Why would Pharaoh do that? It's another attempt by Satan using Pharaoh to prevent the birth of the Messiah, Satan understanding that the Messiah must come from the Hebrew race. And if you want a time in history where Satan got within a millimeter of winning, it was in 2 Chronicles 22, where the usurping queen Athaliah went on a rampage, exterminating all of the royal offspring of the house of Judah. The kings must come from which tribe? Judah. There was almost no one left from Judah. And had it not been for Jehoiada, the priest, hiding baby Joash, the only Davidic descendant, in the temple until Athaliah died, had that not happened, the Davidic line would have been cut off. And Satan would have won. How about the story of Esther in the Persian period, where a wicked man named Haman devises a plan to exterminate the Jewish race? That's another example of Satan working in history to prevent the fulfillment of Genesis 3, verse 15. Then the Messiah is born. Have you noticed that there were several attempts to take Christ out during his earthly life? Prior to him dying on the cross, remember Satan took Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple and he said what? Throw yourself off. Trying to prevent the Messiah from fulfilling his mission. And then you have John 8 verse 59 where they picked up stones to stone him to death. That's Christ because he claimed to be God. And yet he magically or supernaturally, I should say, escapes through the crowd. Or how about all the times around the Sea of Galilee? And out of nowhere comes a storm, kind of like what we're seeing here. Where did the storm come from? These are all part of this first strategy that Satan has to stop either the birth of the Messiah or prevent him from fulfilling his mission. And what is happening in Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, is just the latest chapter in that failed strategy. Satan used the insecurity, it's right there in verse 4. He used the insecurity of a man named Herod to kill all of these innocent male infants in Bethlehem because Satan knew the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem, Micah 5 verse 2, and I'm going to work in history to prevent this Messiah from even coming. I, in my darkened mind, will stop Genesis 3 verse 15, and in the process I will prevent my head from being crushed. That's the conflict that's going on. The invisible spiritual conflict. And guess what, folks? Satan lost round 1. That's the Christmas message. The Christmas message is despite attempt after attempt after attempt after attempt to kill Christ prematurely or to shut off the lineage leading to Christ, God is always in control. He supernaturally superintended, and the Messiah was born. That's why Jesus, 1 Peter 3, 19 and 20, in between his crucifixion and resurrection, descended to where the demons are involved in the Genesis 6 sin. They're incarcerated, those demons involved in that. And he did not euangelizo them, evangelize. The verb is caruso. He proclaimed to them. that they're on the losing side of history. The Messiah was born. The Messiah accomplished his mission despite Satan's first strategy to stop the plan and the work and the program of God. Satan is trying to now move into strategy 2. He's trying to prevent this from happening. Revelation 11 verse 15, where the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of our Christ. He hears that proclamation with trumpet number 7, and he says, you know what, I like ruling the world. So you know what I'm going to do? About halfway through the tribulation period, I'm going to launch a frontal attack against the nation, the woman clothed with the sun and the moon and the 12 stars. Who is that again? Israel. I'm going to gobble up Israel during the final 1,260 days of the tribulation period to prevent the coming of the kingdom. Because I know prophetically that just as the Messiah had to come through the Jewish race, I also know prophetically that the capital city of the kingdom one day will be where? Not Washington, D.C. Jerusalem. A Jewish kingdom. And my goodness, Satan says, I can't let that happen, because once that happens, I'll be bound for 1,000 years with Jesus ruling from David's throne. And then I'll be thrown into the lake of fire at the end of that. So in my darkened mind, I'm going to stop that whole thing from happening by blotting out the nation of Israel. And that's what begins to be explained in Revelation 12, verses 6 through 17, which begins to describe not a past strategy, but a present and a future strategy, a strategy that I believe to some extent is being used right now to prevent the birth of the kingdom. I couldn't prevent the birth of the Messiah, but I'll tell you one thing Satan says in his darkened mind. Dollars to donuts, that kingdom will not come. I know it's been announced, but I'm going to stop it. God makes a move, Satan makes a counter move. And that's what's happening in Revelation 12, 6 through 17, Satan's second strategy. And you say, wow, I'd sure like to hear more about that. Well, you have to come back next week when we'll talk about it. But it truly